Hello and welcome to End Goals, an LCMS Youth Ministry podcast. I'm host Reverend Mark Kiesling and I'm with DCE Juliana Schultz. We are here to bring parents, church workers, and lay leaders discussions and resources to help your youth ministry meet its end goal, which is young people who are disciples of Jesus Christ for life. Today, we continue our research series talking about unintentional neglect and how we can prioritize Gen Z based on what we learned from our research.
We are continuing on in this series of research done by LCMS Youth Ministry, especially targeting that research that we did in 2017 on millennials in the LCMS. For that research, LCMS Youth Ministry partnered with LCMS Research to conduct a study of young adult retention in the LCMS and in the larger church. This three-part study sought to learn about millennials, now young adults, to help prepare for working with Gen Z who are currently in our youth ministry. If you want to hear more about those parts of research, you can go back and listen to some of the previous episodes. But today we're going to be talking about how we maybe hope our findings will help you with young adults and with youth ministry for our current generation. We're grateful to have an amazing team that worked on that design for the research and processed the findings. Just if you haven't noticed, that team included Mark, myself, Ryan Cornett, who you've heard from in a few of these episodes, who works for LCMS Research, Dr. Dave Reeder, who was with us last week, and Dr. Kevin Borchers, who's with us today.
Our study wanted to look at many facets of the relationship between congregations and young people. We weren't entirely sure what pieces would prove to be important. As we looked through the findings, we saw pieces of hope and reasons for, frustration. And many of the things that we found pointed to something our team started calling unintentional neglect. And as we think about the young people in our church and what might impact them staying in the LCMS, this unintentional neglect is one of the most surprising and perhaps easiest things that we found that we can act on. At the same time, we wanted to start thinking about how our findings can be related to Gen Z, both what continues to be true from millennials to Gen Z and what is different about the generation of young people in our youth ministry right now. To break this down with us, we have Dr. Kevin Borchers. Dr. Borchers has served as a DC for 39 years and currently serves as a member of the Concordia-Chicago faculty. He teaches primarily Christian education courses to students pursuing careers as professional church workers, particularly DCEs. Prior to his role at Concordia-Chicago, he served as a parish DCE in Chicago and northern Minnesota, central Illinois, and northern Wisconsin. He has a PhD in organizational leadership and a master's in family life. He is married to Brenda, has 3 wonderful kids who are all millennials, and 6 grandchildren, most of whom are Gen Z.
Kevin, welcome to End Goals. We're so excited to have you in this conversation. You were such a huge and valuable part of our research team. So maybe can you share a little with us about your vocations and what brought you into that research team?
It's good to be with you both again. Having served as a director of Christian education, most of my focus during all of those years was with this generation, this young adult, this young youth and children's ministry. That was my focus for those years in the parish. And over the course of those years, I saw all of these kids that were staying connected, but I saw this other group of kids that weren't. And that just it's become kind of a passion of mine to find out what's going on in generations that are changing them, changing their views about faith and about church and those types of things. And then also connecting them. How do we either attract them back or keep them connected in some way? So that's what brought me to want to be a part of your team.
Well, and we were so pleased you joined us. I think my favorite part was we started asking people, like, who should we be talking to about this topic? Totally independent of anything else. Somebody emailed the LCMS to say, you should be talking to Kevin Borchers about this. And we were like, oh, fancy that. We've already talked to him.
Yeah, I think it was said, like, Kevin has all the answers, I think is what
right? Yeah. I was like, well, good. We're talking to the right guy.
I don't know how to feel about that going forward this morning at this point.
So super helpful in helping us think and analyze a lot of the things that we saw. In our discussions in the research team, as we kind of talked through and processed through the findings that we had. I think it was you or it was somebody else on the team who really brought this term unintentional neglect to the surface that we really resonated with for a number of reasons. What were you seeing in the data that sort of prompted that to be a theme that we pull out?
I think it was right before we did the Youth Ministry Summit that as we were really going in depth in some of the research at that point, and some of the statistics that jumped out to me as we began diving into it were the fact that 23% of the congregations in our synod didn't have usable records where they could track youth that were being confirmed. In some cases, there were congregations that had written records that weren't overly usable, but it was this 1/4 of our churches, if that's representative, had nothing that they could draw from. They didn't know where those students were. And another one that stuck out was that just under half, about somewhere between 40-45% of the congregations didn't know where their young adults were. I mean, they had confirmed them. Some of them maybe had stayed a little active during their high school years, but as they left home or went away to college or moved for jobs, they had no idea where they were, and no way to track them down. And that, as a minister, as a DCE, that breaks my heart.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that we don't know, as we value the relationships that we have with the people. It broke my heart. And one of the other things that stood out to me in this process is that of those that stayed connected, over half of them felt, you know, that the church, their congregation, had helped them through some of the transitional stages of life, you know, moving out of mom and dad's house into the college and then on to the work. The congregation was one of the biggest supports, and the people of the congregation were one of the biggest supports. And so losing that, I felt like it was doing damage. And it was preventable damage. And that's why I think right before Summit is when I coined that phrase, unintentional neglect.
I really think that nobody wants to lose young people. I mean, I think we talk to youth ministers and they have a heart for it. And it is truly, in some degrees, unintentional, not malicious, not because we don't want these young people to be in our church, but truly a matter of like, we just don't have the capacity or the ability to track them and to continue to connect with them.
I think in our congregations, we hear that. You've heard it, and I hear it as well. Where did our young people go? Where did they go? And I think the question that those in church leadership at all levels, from the congregation all the way up, is why don't you know where they went? It's that if it's about the relationships that we have on the front lines, then we need to know. We need to have that idea.
Yeah. When you started talking about this, Kevin, I mean, one thing that came to my mind, I kept thinking like, okay, if I now take a call into a parish or for pastors or DCEs or others who are moving from one church to another, who don't have a long-term relationship with the congregation, it's like, boy, I mean, you need those records to understand who the congregation is, who the flock is, who are the people we're connecting with. So like, if you don't have good numbers there, good data there, where do you start? And to be able to understand like where those relational connections are. So that was one of the things that always popped into my mind. But why else is it important for congregations to keep good records for their members? Maybe especially for confirmands. You mentioned some, but are there other like specific things when we're talking about the record keeping that they should have in mind about that?
Well, I think you kind of started to allude to it there, Mark, when there's a law gospel, our good theology, right? There's a law gospel effect in regards to being a nonprofit organization, which is what churches are considered to be by the Internal Revenue Service. Mm-hmm. The law part of that is, in order to maintain that status, you have to keep good records, particularly if you are soliciting or are you receiving any kind of donations from your congregation. You're legally responsible to the Internal Revenue Service to provide accounting for that, and you have to provide that to the membership, which means that you have to maintain good membership records. That's the law aspect. But then there's the gospel, the call of Jesus to Peter when he says, Peter, do you love me? Care for my sheep, feed my sheep. care for my lambs. And it's the relationship aspect. We have no way as church workers transition. Mark, you brought it up. As church workers transition and receive calls from God and from congregations to go serve elsewhere, where their gifts and talents are needed in the body of Christ. New people coming in, or people that are filling in the gaps, need to have some kind of way to, what are the relationships that are already established, and how do we keep in touch with people? And I think that's, in today's world, in our COVID world today, I think that's even more important, because we're not able to be with people face to face. I'm not able to go over to the local university campus. I can go to my campus, but I can't go to one of the other university campuses because of guidelines, to see one of my youth or to see one of my young adults who's there. And so we need to have some kind of a way to track it. So there's a gospel aspect of feeding and caring for the sheep and lambs that goes along with maintaining those records. And there's historical as well.
Right.
You could get into that.
It's amazing to me just how important good records suddenly became when in our new COVID world, when we went to this situation where we couldn't meet face to face. And I think if you didn't see the evidence of needing to have good records before, certainly you do now, as people are trying to communicate when worship is, how we are managing worship, down to youth ministry. So really it is vital to that maintaining of a relationship for us and our young people. I know unintentional neglect. Really, we talk a lot of that was maintaining the records, knowing where people are. But I do think there's a lot of we saw there also about this neglect that can happen in transition, either when a church worker transitions and people on the margins get lost because there aren't good records, or just because people aren't transferring that kind of relational care, or sort of not having that transition. You referenced this earlier, not having somebody walk them through transitions in life and have that be a moment where they kind of drop off. We certainly saw that in the drop off we saw post high school graduation. That transition, when it's not cared for, can really be very quickly become kind of that unintentional neglect. How might congregations move from that unintentionally losing young people at that moment of transition to deliberate ministry as they move through those times?
I think the key word there is deliberate. We were deliberate in selecting the concept of relationships in entitling our study, right? And because that's what we found to be one of the most important aspect. And I think it comes down to individual people that are doing ministry, whether you're doing it professionally or whether you're doing it as a volunteer. It's being intentional and focusing on developing and maintaining those relationships. When COVID hit, a lot of people were like, I can't see my family. I can't see my kids. My wife was crying because she couldn't see her grandchildren, right? And so we had to find new ways of being intentional about that with individuals. And as it relates, and it kind of relates to what we found in the research too, as it relates to young adults, to Gen Z, there's this aspect of people, they need to feel like they know other people, that they can connect with other people. It's the issue of those of us that are either professional or even volunteers in ministry, and just congregational members in general, developing relationships so that each of us knows other people, but more importantly, that common need that we share to be known by other people. Okay. Relationships can be one-way streets. They can be two-way streets. But the best relationships are those that are built on trust. They're two-way. There's mutual trust there, that I can be open with you. I can talk about the things that I need to talk about with you without feeling like you're judging me. I can do that in my small group, and we're all older, I should say, older adults. We're over 50, but at the same time, those are young adults, our teens and our college age students, and those that are just out of college in the workforce. They have a need to be able to express themselves without being judged and without judging. I have to add, I'll add that, and not feeling like we're condemning them. And sometimes I think that does come across, that they can feel like we're looking down on them because of the ideas. And let's keep in mind that with Gen Z in particular, with those that are, 23, 24 years old and younger, they're still forming their worldview. They're still developing their values. And that's being impacted by all the different people that are around them, parents, church, the workplace, their friends. All of that comes into play. And so they need a place where they can be able to ask those open-ended questions and to get an answer, or even sometimes it helps the relationship just as much to say, I don't know, but I'll find out, and can we take this journey together? But I think also there's this issue of families. My background in family ministries looks at everything from a system, right?
Yeah.
And so what's going on in the home can sometimes be a mirror, has to be mirrored by what's going on in their lives as well. And so, as we work with I tell the students in my youth ministry class, for example, you're never just working with teenagers. You're always working with teenagers and their parents and their siblings and oftentimes grandparents. And now, if we've got, depending on what's your family situation, where you're being raised by a grandparent, a lot of them are. Those are all the home, the family is a good connecting point for the current. But when those youth transition, and that's the issue here, when they transition away from home, sometimes the only way that we have to stay in touch with them or to keep in touch with them is through parents, through the family. And so I think it's just important to maintain those kinds of relationships back where we're at, especially today, if they're going away for jobs, if they're going away for school, military service, or what have you. We touch on the accurate record keeping. That's a tool. Mm-hmm. That's only a tool. It's all it is. It's a tool that contributes to our relationships, which is the most important part. And it's maintaining that relational connection is what helps us to be the tool in Christ's hands to maintain the relationship that they have with Him.
One word that came to mind is you're kind of saying some of that is, I think, this kind of capacity for empathy, maybe, by the church, by parents, by peers, whatever it might be, to understand situations that young people are going through. And so I think Juliana kind of said this in the introduction. We researched millennials, we heard from millennials to hear about their experience in the church and to help and support them and to help churches connect with millennials, but obviously to talk about youth ministry with Gen Z. And you're seeing things as a parent to millennials, as a grandparent to Gen Z young people. I want to talk a little bit maybe about, there's certainly going to be those bedrock things that we see, relationships, transitions, those things are going to happen regardless of the generation. But what are some of the ways in which you see Gen Z is showing to be different than previous generations? And I know right now, coming out of COVID, there's some things we're probably still keeping our eyes on, and how does that shape a generation? But maybe both, at least before what you saw, and maybe some things we're even pointing towards moving ahead. What are some differences that you see between those generations?
Generationally, I'm a proponent of every generation is defined by an event that's taken place in history. Okay, I mean, we talk about millennials being defined by 9/11, right? We talk about Gen Z being defined as the latchkey kids, the first generation to stay at home. This generation, Gen Z, those that are 23, 24 and younger, have been more greatly impacted and defined. Their lives have been defined by COVID-19, I think, than any other generation. We were talking previously about how some of the other generations, we'll just have to roll with the punches. This generation can't do that. They're not equipped yet to do that type of thing. Gen Z, one of their number one values as a generation overall, especially the older ones, is completing their education, whether it's high school, whether it's college, making those transitions from high school to college or college into the workforce. Their educations and the completion of that, especially for the seniors in high school or college, were absolutely disrupted. Everything was taken away from them. We see it in the sports world too. Those that are going to be seniors that were looking to play in the NFL or professional sports, they're deeply concerned whether or not their career as a professional athlete is now going to happen. Those that were in the workforce, the oldest Gen Zs that were already out of college or they had not gone to college and entered the workforce, guess who the first ones to be laid off were?
Right.
It was Gen Z. They were the ones who propagated those unemployment numbers when COVID first hit, because they're in those lower level jobs. They're in those service industry jobs still. So that's been an area of difference that affect this other one. This generation, more than any other, um, is defined by racial and ethnic diversity. This generation is by its own makeup more diverse. I'll just compare baby boomers, for example, because I'm one of the youngest baby boomers. My generation, my baby boomer generation, were basically viewed as being 82% white. This generation, Gen Z, is only 52% white in the United States. We could see increases across the board, especially amongst Hispanic youth and Asian youth. African American Black youth have pretty much remained, the numbers have remained relatively flat, but as far as those other two, we've seen particular growth, and the greatest growth has taken place amongst the Asian population, the Asian youth in ours. But it's not just their numbers in regards to diversity; it's their view and acceptance of diversity. They're more likely to have friends of racial difference than what you and I would have. They're okay with multiracial relationships, much more than, say, my grandparents or my parents might have been. So that racial diversity is a big deal. But there are some things that we need to recognize about the issue of diversity. And diversity is not, it's not homogenous across the United States amongst Gen Zs. It's geographic. Particularly, where our church body, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, are found here in the Midwest, those numbers pretty much fall in line with those national numbers. But if you go out onto the West Coast, instead of being 52% Caucasian white, that number drops to 40%. And the number among Hispanics and Asians goes a lot higher than what it was. So we have to recognize that there's some diversity issues there that are definitely have an effect on the differences in this generation as well. I think some of the other things, Mark, to your question, this generation and the millennial generation, the one we did our study on, they share similar values, but they're not in the same order. Where this generation has a higher value on completing their education and even having a formalized education, because more of their parents were college educated, had one or more college degrees than millennials even did. And that just gets the difference between generations gets greater as you get older as well. That's one area I think that they're different in. This is also this is also the generation that is most targeted for marketing. Everything you watch on TV, quite honestly, is designed to attract this generation. One, because of not so much now during COVID-19, but they're so large. The Gen Z generation is rapidly growing to be the largest. Okay. And we're finding that out, and they're going to, just like the boomers did, they're going to change different pieces of society as they get older.
It's amazing to me that, we can look at generational data, and we studied a lot of this about Gen Z, even before COVID. And then now we have this COVID experience, and I'm going, I have no idea how this is going to impact them, in large part because you're thinking about exactly what you said, that they are such a high achievement generation. They're all about what they want to get out. They want to be They want to own their own businesses. They are a very action oriented generation. And then to suddenly have something like this step in a very critical moment for many of them as they enter the workforce, as they enter college, as they enter high school, to be so disruptive to their plans. That's a prayer for me for those young people as they navigate through that. And then also to have on top of that, this identity of them being the most diverse generation we've seen in a variety of different ways. And then to have so many issues coming up in our culture around racism and race, for us to say, like, okay, what is that going to do in that kind of particularly to Gen Z's generation and to their formation of their identities in this young age?
I agree. And I think this is something that we in the church need to pay attention to. If this, I like the phrase or the term that you used, Juliana, disruptive. If this generation is going to be a disruptor, okay, not in a negative sense necessarily, but they're going to be ones that are going to change is going to occur because of just the sheer size of this generation. We as a church, a historical church body, how do we do that? How are we going to cope with that? Because those that are still in the congregational leadership and in district leadership and in synodical leadership to some extent are of that early Gen Z, late boomer thinking generation. And if they're more diverse, if their thinking is more diverse and more disruptive than previous, how are we going to deal with the conflicts involved in organizational change? And not that we're going to compromise anything about faith. I don't hear anybody, except from maybe on some of the fringe areas within the church calling for any kind of theological change. I hear, how we do things. And I won't even go down some of the paths with that, but we have to deal with some of those issues and wrestle with it. And the only way we're going to be able to do that, let's go back to the beginning, is through having a relationship where we can sit down and we can talk and we can work through that in a manner of trust and care and love for one another.
Practically as an institution, right? Practically as an institution, I think the church is underprepared for the disruption that Gen Z is going to bring. And we should certainly be looking at what it is that this generation is asking, what they're be in that relationship with them so that we understand how I think they can bring some really positive ways to share the gospel, some new ways of taking Jesus into a culture that maybe where that's very countercultural. They have a lot of ability to do things in a new and different way that's going to be really encouraging if we take the time to get to know them, if we take the time to understand them.
Exactly.
We're certainly not going to go into, like you said, all those specific ways that can happen, but want to give you a chance to talk about maybe a hope that you see for Gen Z's discipleship in their faith and also the relationship with the church. Any big picture stuff that you see coming out of that, words of encouragement you'd give to our congregations about that?
We talked prior to the last National Youth Gathering about the issue of vocation. And I've kind of adjusted my definition. It's more of a personal adjustment of the idea of vocation. There is that calling from God, that plan that God has had, and listening to that call and what God wants you to do. But I think there's also this issue of passion. This generation is really passionate about a lot of things, okay? And I think it's coming to an understanding of what drives that passion. And I hate to sound like we're using it, but how can we as a church capitalize on that passion that God has given them, and how can we have some of those conversations about those passionate issues so that it impacts not just this generation, but the society as a whole, because aren't we called to do ministry to the entire church, right? And so how can we use the passion that God has given this generation to make an impact on society? Because one way or another, they're going to make an impact. Right. And so how can we stay connected? I think looking at what we've talked about with the relationships, how we stay connected with them, and remain not only a support and influence, but just someone that they can turn to, and looking at it. And I think that's one of the things that gives me hope, is looking at what they see as their vocation and their passion. Building those relationships, that's the biggest part.
I would certainly say that we have, based on all of the meetings we had around this research, could probably talk about this for another set of hours. We never went short on our meetings, for sure, as we thought through a lot of these issues. And,
not at all.
And so I would definitely point you, both if you go to the eSource, Dr. Borchers wrote a great piece that we have up there about that unintentional neglect and the value of record keeping. If you need to print that out, send that to some leaders, or for you to process that yourself. We also, certainly want to send you to the book. Dr. Borchers was a heavy part of the chapter on Gen Z that's a part of that book. It's still free and available at CPH. So we want to thank you for being here and having this discussion with us, particularly on these issues. We know there's so much more to say, but we're grateful for your participation in that.
Thanks for having me with you all. It's good to see you again.
Great. So while we didn't ask Gen Z directly questions in our research, there are clearly things we've learned while continuing that can continue to give us insight into that generation and into future generations. It's important for us to remember that while generational data gives us valuable information, it's not nearly as important, as we talked about today, as knowing your young people individually. No one can be completely explained by large-scale data. Instead, we can use generational data to start conversations and engage better in learning about the young people that we serve.
We also want to encourage youth leaders to be intentional about how to develop relationships, keep records, and walk with students through transitions. And while we know that there are many demands on your time as a youth leader, we know how unintentional neglect most often results in young people walking away from the congregation, either for a time or for good, and that your service is so very important in keeping them connected to the church.
So some closing questions for you to consider. How might you ensure your congregation has good, usable records that can last through staff transitions?
Second question is, how can you provide additional support to young people during times of transitions?
And finally, how can you learn more and prepare for Gen Z in your youth ministry? We will continue to keep you in our prayers as you do very important service to youth. And as you navigate the many demands on your time, we hope that our findings can shed a little light on how you can intentionally care for the young people in your congregation.
If you like this podcast, don't forget to subscribe and give us a positive review. It helps other people find us. End Goals Podcast is a production of LCMS Youth Ministry and KFUO Radio. To find out more about LCMS Youth Ministry or to find links to resources mentioned, go to kfuo.org/youth ministry. Thank you for listening and caring for the young people of our church.